Welcome to my in-depth country profile on Ecuador. I hope through this presentation you gain a greater understanding of Ecuador and the role English plays there. Alright, so the first big question is why Ecuador? There are two big reasons why I chose Ecuador for my in-depth country profile. The first reason is being that I had no prior knowledge about Ecuador before starting this project, and I really wanted to broaden my knowledge base about another Latin American country. The second reason is that my L2 is Spanish, and if I were to go teach English abroad, I would do so in a Spanish-speaking country. Alright, now for a very brief history of Ecuador. Ecuador was first settled by the Spanish in 1826. They were under Spanish rule until the early 19th century, and then they broke away from Spanish and joined Gran Colombia, which includes present-day Venezuela and Colombia. They withdrew from Gran Colombia in 1830 and became their own separate entity. In the recent past, they've adopted a new constitution in 2008, and they continue to be an evolving country today. As you can see, Ecuador is very, very linguistically diverse. Their official language is Spanish, but they also recognize a second official language, and that is called Quechua. And the light fuchsia color that you see around the whole country represents areas that speak Quechua. There are 800,000 monolinguals of Quechua, and it's the most developing language in Ecuador. English education in Ecuador aligns very well with any language education here in the United States. The Ministry of Education in Ecuador provides standards to guide EFL teaching in Ecuador, and the standards include reading, writing, listening, speaking, and culture, and there are 3 proficiency levels, A1, A2, and B1. Although they're taught a very standard form of English, their accents when speaking English can vary due to their L1, whether it's Quechua or Spanish or another indigenous language. A very common substitute that the speakers of English in Ecuador make is that they substitute the theta sound, the TH sound in English, with the D sound, the D, and that's according to the Speech Accent Archive. Now, comparing Ecuador's culture to the United States, I think that the biggest difference between the U.S. and Ecuador is the fact that the U.S. is more of an individualistic culture and Ecuador is a collectivist culture. So I think that in the United States, we focus a lot on ourselves and improving ourselves rather than focusing on the groups that we belong to. In Ecuador, they're very oriented to the groups in which they belong, whether it be race, ethnicity, religion, social class. So when teaching these future students in Ecuador, I need to keep in mind about the fact that they identify greatly with their groups in which they associate themselves with, and I need to make sure that I'm not making them push their boundaries between groups because being a part of that group is very important to them. This is a quote I received from Dr. Lake, who is a Spanish professor here at UWL. Every year, she brings a group of students to Ecuador to volunteer and study the language while being in a Spanish-speaking country. I asked her what the biggest difference between Ecuador and the United States was to her, and she responded with, "The biggest difference? Wow, hard question. I think it would be the more relaxed attitude toward life. If buses don't run on time, it's no big deal, for example. I think another difference is that people are very happy with what they have. It doesn't matter if it's a lot or a little." The education system in Ecuador is comprised of 6 years of primary school and 6 years of secondary education. The secondary education is split into 2 levels. The first level is El Ciclo Básico, and the second is El Ciclo Diversificado, and I found that on west.com. Students may then move on to university level education, in which they follow a similar path as we do here in the United States. So they go for 4 years for their undergraduate, and then 2 years for graduate education, and then they can go even further on, just like we can, to get a doctorate or go on to medical school or other specialized fields. The amount of resources that a school in Ecuador has depends greatly on whether the school is situated in a very rural or very highly populated part of Ecuador. So, as you can see, the western coast of Ecuador is much more populated than that of the eastern, and on the eastern side of Ecuador is where you find a lot of the more rural schools and the schools with less resources. There is a very large difference between private schools and public schools in Ecuador. In private schools, students have a lot more access to resources, and there are a lot more well qualified teachers that teach in the private schools who will help kids get to the college level. However, in public schools, which are often found in the more rural parts of Ecuador, they don't have as many resources as the private schools, but they are free for children to attend. Now we're going to discuss the English language education policies in Ecuador. When I asked Dr. Lake her opinion on the role of English in Ecuador, she responded with, English plays a large part in certain sectors of society. For example, the wealthier classes generally know English or use English in their jobs. Lower middle class to the poorer classes don't use English much unless they work with tourists. I get the feeling a lot of people would like to know English but don't have the means to study it. I really didn't see much English in advertisements. Their satellite channels, if people have a satellite, right, has loads of American programs, so people can watch TV and learn if they want. According to BritishCouncil.org, Ecuador's English language policy currently aims to have English as an optional language from grade 2 and a mandatory language from grade 8. So, as you can see from the graph, a majority of students learn English during their time in secondary school, and the amount of learners continues to decrease as you get into primary schooling and other options such as while abroad or studying English for a career. Also, according to BritishCouncil.org, a large reason why students haven't learned English is because of the lack of access to government funded programs. So, students don't have the financial means to study English. The Ministry of Education in Ecuador has set standards for English language teachers, and those include proficiency in the language and understanding of cultural beliefs of that language, so English, a solid sense of curriculum and being able to plan lessons that will only lead your students into the right direction in their English language learning process, and an understanding of how to assess your students and overall professionalism. The first challenge I'm going to discuss is the education challenge. So, one of the standards placed on EFL teachers is that teachers will collaborate with other school staff and the community to help improve the learning environment. So, this could pose a challenge for certain EFL teachers if the community and the school staff are not supportive of that teacher's teaching style. This challenge could be solved by making sure that before you take the position, your views on education align well with that of your peers' views, and if not, then evaluate whether or not you should take a teaching job at that specific school. If you still want to take the job, then I'd focus on how you can communicate with the higher ups and the superiors at your school what your needs are as a teacher and what you need from them and how you expect your class to run. And you can go from there and see if you guys can collaborate still, even though you have conflicting views. As far as linguistic challenges go, I think the biggest linguistic challenge that you'll face in Ecuador is the concept of the two recognized official languages of Ecuador. So you don't know if your students will be native speakers of Quechua or Spanish when you first enter the English classroom. So, my solution that I thought of for this would be to evaluate the kids at the beginning of the year, which you will probably be doing anyway, and figure out what their L1 is and go from there. It will be important for you to have different strategies to teach native speakers of Quechua and native speakers of Spanish because they're not going to learn English the same way because of their different L1s. Now for cultural challenges, in my opinion, the biggest cultural challenge that you will face when in Ecuador, especially coming from somewhere like the United States, is the concept of time and the relaxed concept of time that they have in Ecuador. So I've heard of people who have taught English in Colombia, for example, who their the teacher is ready to go at 4 o'clock, ready for class, and no students are there. Class starts at 4, no students are in their classroom. So a big way that you can get around this cultural challenge is to plan for their concept of time, not your concept of time. So if you don't want to get to work until 4 o'clock, which is when class is supposed to start, and then you have that 20 minutes of prep time until your students start walking into your classroom, then you can plan for that. Think of it as more of a blessing than a challenge. Overall, I've learned a lot about Ecuador through this project. I've learned about the culture of Ecuador that exists under the tip of the iceberg and about the indigenous cultures and the role that they play. This knowledge will help me know what to expect upon my arrival in Ecuador and how to better educate my future students of English.